Thank you, everyone, and welcome from wherever you are tuning in today. Before I hand this over to our speakers, I would like to invite you to join me in prayer. Let us pray. Holy One, creator of all that is seen and unseen, of story and of song, of heartbeat and of tears, of bodies, souls, voices, and all relations. You are the God of all truth and the way of all reconciliation. Uphold with your love and compassion all who open their lives in the sacred sharing of their stories. Breathe in us the grace to trust in your loving forgiveness, that we may face our histories with courage. Touch us through the holy gift of story, that those who speak and those who listen may behold your own redeeming presence. Guide us with holy wisdom to enter through the gates of remorse, that our feet may walk gently and firmly on the way of justice and healing. Amen. Thank you, everyone. So, with no further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome our two speakers, the Right Reverend Dr. Logan McMenamie, Bishop Emeritus of the Diocese of British Columbia, and the Right Reverend Shane Parker, Bishop of the Diocese of Ottawa. Both Bishop Logan and Bishop Shane have been strong leaders in reconciliation in their respective dioceses and in the Anglican Church of Canada. And both bishops are deeply connected to the community of the Cross of Nails. So Bishop Shane and Bishop Logan, we look forward to your conversation today. Over to you.
So Logan, you and I have to pretend there's no one else in this Zoom room and we're going to have a conversation. And why don't we begin, Logan, with you telling me a little bit about when you first began stepping into reconciliation.
Okay, thank you. Just recognize that I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Habitat, the Lake Howardson First Nations. Give thanks for their hospitality and welcome as I live here in Yubo. As you know, we were both deans of cathedrals, and my kind of jumping in the deep end was when I was dean of the cathedral in Victoria. Bishop John Hannon was the urban Indigenous ministry after he retired from Caledonia in Victoria, and he came to me as an honorary assistant. He said, "I'd be an honorary assistant if you would do one thing. I'm retiring from this Indigenous ministry in the Victoria area. Would you take it over? And I know it's going to be different, but would you take over and work with it?" So we began to bring together circles, healing circles, of the urban First Nations people. There's some Kwakwaka'wakw who are Anglicans, there's some Nuchalnet who grew up in United Church, and the Coast Salish who came up as Roman Catholics. And there was at the first gathering, I learned how welcoming, how forgiving First Nations people were. I came with an apprehension, but they came to engage in conversation. And we gathered them in the cathedral chapter room. And at that time, I started the conversation, told them who I was. And I said, let's go around in a counterclockwise and introduce ourselves and say where we're from. And the first speaker said, not in my culture. We never go around in a countercultural way in my culture. We always go around clockwise. So I said, okay, I apologize. I'm really, really sorry. Forgive me for doing that. And I went around the other direction. And the first speaker says, no, 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 no. In our culture, we never go around clockwise. We always go around counterclockwise. And then there was laughing and joking. And I realized that they were really having me on and teasing. But it was a good learning experience for me in the sense of the different nations and the way they introduced themselves and the respect of clockwise or counterclockwise. And it was Bobby Joseph who was part of that first gathering. And he says to me, Logan, you set the protocol. You tell them what your protocol is, and we'll all just join into your protocol. So that was my first real introduction. And it turned out to be a very good way to begin relationships. What about you, Shane? How did you get involved?
Yeah. Well, Logan, I would first begin by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And my first memories, Logan, are from Treaty 8 territory, Fort Nelson, British Columbia, quite a ways north of you and a little bit east of you. And the Fort Nelson's First Nation, Slavey and Dene peoples lived in that region. And so my very first awareness of Indigenous peoples, of First Nations, was when I was a very young child, and my parents, to their credit, used to pick up individuals or families as they made their way into Fort Nelson. We were living just outside Fort Nelson on a military base. And I'll never forget, being in a car with a man or a woman, or a man and a woman and children, and just the smiles and loveliness of just spending time together in a completely unaffected way, and that memory is important as I continued to journey into reconciliation, because in the end we meet one another in our humanity, and when we understand one another as profoundly equal in the eyes of God, we're more predisposed to be open to hearing one another's stories, to a free and fair exchange of our stories. And over the years, as I look back, I realized that my relationship and my understanding of reconciliation was, in the first instance, sort of innocent, as I've described it, but it was also kind of flawed, in the sense that as I grew older, as I became aware of the tremendous inequities and the profoundly negative experience the Indigenous peoples of Canada had at the hand of colonizers, the imperial forces, my first perspective was to want to help in some way. There's a problem, I maybe I should go and work in the north. And I say that was kind of a flawed understanding of reconciliation, because I did not begin by listening carefully to the story, to the experiences of First Nations people as they were spoken in their own words. And that became, an important realization that really I have nothing to offer. There's no way that I can help until I've entered fully into the experience of Indigenous peoples by listening very, very carefully. And I think it's really at that point when I actually began stepping into reconciliation in a good way. Long journey to get to that point.
Yeah, I think for sure it's that recognition. I have so many people who have come to me when I was bishop who say, Bishop, what can we do? What can we do for the First Nations? What can we do as a community, as individuals? And the answer is, you don't go into do, you go into be. You're going to listen, you're going to learn, you're going to journey with. And in journeying with, you will recognize your role in those relationships and building those relationships.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my most vivid misstep, because we're going to make those, I think, as non-Indigenous people, when we try to walk in the way of reconciliation, whether it's not knowing which way a circle should turn, or whether you're in charge of the reading or not, like understanding cultural things is, of course, very important in any context. And we do make missteps, and it's good to acknowledge those. I once made a misstep, which was probably the best learning experience I had. I was at a gathering. Some of you will recall the gathering at Pinawa, the Road to Warm Springs. It was a gathering to discuss and consider a self-determining Indigenous church in Canada in 2017. And I was part of a panel of 4 non-Indigenous people who were speaking about our own experience of reconciliation. What does reconciliation mean to us? And it was very powerful in the sense that a number of the Indigenous people who were present, and it was, 50% Indigenous peoples, 50% non-Indigenous, thanked us and said, we've never heard Indigenous people, non-Indigenous people, talk about what reconciliation means for them. Usually they're apologizing or patronizing. But to actually, to hear speak from their hearts about their own experiences and so on. So it turned out that the four panelists were still sitting at the table, and it devolved into kind of a question and answer period, except no one was designated to answer the questions, right? So someone asked something about, will the self-determining Indigenous church have to follow the canon law of the Anglican Church of Canada? And there was dead silence in the room. And I thought, well, I know a little bit about canon law. So I went up and I spoke and I talked about, canon law comes from here, there, and everywhere. But mostly we make up canon law when we live, and then we write rules for what we've learned along the way. So, kind of go for it, prepare your own canon law. And then afterwards, Bishop Priscilla came up to me and said, you've caused great offense. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I was genuinely flummoxed. Anyway, in the end, I spoke with an Indigenous woman who said, what I was hearing when you were speaking was a white man saying, you stupid Indians, don't you know what canon law is? I would not have understood anything about what I was saying to be received, but that was how it was being received, as very paternalistic, very instructive. And she went on to say, it's good that you're here. It's good that you know about reconciliation. But as you said earlier, Logan, be with us. You don't have to talk. You don't have to help. We will invite you in and just be with us. It was a very, very important moment in my step taking, and it was a misstep, as I see now. Yeah.
And that's a very important thing to listen, especially for us as bishops and for us as clergy. We took the Diocesan Council. If you know Vancouver Island, the centre of Vancouver Island is Campbell River. And Diocesan Council had never been north of Campbell River. So I decided that Campbell River was going to Alert Bay on Cromarton Island, which is one of our Indigenous churches in the north, an Indigenous community, so that they could be there and hear those stories firsthand and not hearing from other people. And we gathered there, and it was a wonderful experience for Diocesan Council. Cromarton Island is, for us, I always said, it's like Iona. It's a spirituality of presence and being there and being on that island and in that community. And I'd done a lot of work in reconciliation, but in our culture, you stand up and you say, well, let's hear from Diocesan Council first. Let's Diocesan Council introduce themselves. And one of the elders I knew really well came over, put his hand on my shoulder and said, Bishop, elders speak first. And that was that kind of sense of that we are there to listen, and we are there not to speak, but to hear their stories and hear where they are and learn about reconciliation from their point of view. Also, as you said, reconciliation is not a one-way event. Reconciliation for us as settlers and for us as a church, reconciliation needs to really touch and affect us in the way we live, and not just on one level, but on every level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so true.
It's interesting.
Yeah, that's so true. And a few weeks ago, we had Michelle Good speaking in a lecture in our diocese. It's actually online if anyone wants to watch it. And she said for her people, reconciliation means control of resources. That's a really vivid sign and signal that reconciliation is being affected. Most non-Indigenous Canadians wouldn't understand that. We'd look to softer things in a sense in the first instance. And when we open ourselves as non-Indigenous people to build relationships, to build friendships, to actually come to know individuals and communities in a respectful way, not to go as students to study, but to establish a friendship, to to get to know one another, to laugh together, and if you're being teased, you're included, you're
Yeah.
good. Have you found, Logan, have you developed personal friendships with Indigenous people as you've walked the way?
There's a number of different folk that I've begun relationships with, and that teasing is so very much part of it. After I walked the island, I was at a gathering in Guildford Island, and one of the elders stood up and said, "I know why this bishop walked the island. He's Scottish. He wouldn't pay the bus fare." And the priest who was there leaned over and said, "I think you're in. I think you're in." But those relationships are really good. There's an elder who I'm very close to. He's from Kingham on the mainland. There's 4 communities on the mainland that are part of our diocese, a parish. There's Kingham, Wakeman, Hopetown, and Guildford Island. And Alec Nelson is his name. And Alec's been an amazing support for me throughout my relationship here. And when I was bishoping, he continues to support and understand where I am. So that relationship means a great deal to me.
Mm-hmm.
And is that honesty? Alex can be honest with me and challenge me as well. We need that.
Yeah. I've developed a very close relationship with Albert Dumont, who is officially my Algonquin advisor. Our relationship began in 2015 when I was the dean of the cathedral in Ottawa. We hosted a number of events with Kairos as the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The final events of that commission were unfolding. And someone came down to my office and said, there's this guy who wants to smudge in the lackey room. You better talk to him. So I went into the lackey room and there was Albert. He's a tall guy, tall as I am. And I said, well, just stay away from the smoke alarms and the sprinklers and you should be okay. So he smudged the room, but I really felt called just to stay in the room, like a very strong sense that I need to be here. And we sat together without saying too much for the longest time. And it was the beginning of a very, very important friendship. And for both of us, to kind of stay with it, to stay with the awkwardness of, what's this supposed to be? Here's an Anglican priest and an Algonquin spiritual teacher. What could we possibly, where is this going to go? And gradually through time and through that friendship, which is a full friendship, we share much in common and, laugh and joke and tease and can be outrageous with one another in all the right ways. But I realized that we are in many ways, because I know his story very, very well and hold it in my heart, he also knows my story. He knows some of the difficult experiences I have had in my life, which have called upon me to develop a heart of reconciliation as well, and all that means. But we are a guide for one another as we navigate through the journey or the way of reconciliation from 2 very different communities, which are in many ways hard to understand from the outside, and that's been really important. I think that for non-Indigenous people, our relationships with Indigenous people should not be sort of teach or tell. Well, why do you guys do that? You've got to be very, very careful with that. Like go read your books and watch YouTube. But in a good friendship, you can ask, like I don't understand that. Can you explain that to me? I'm genuinely confused, and to kind of understand some of the the internal politics and the internal debates and the rivalries and everything else that take place within any community, but in particular Indigenous communities, has been just incredibly enriching and sobering. Albert we're honest with one another. He will call me out if something doesn't sound right, and there's enough trust that we can do that, which is important.
I think that's the point you made there is really important, is that it's not that relationship to learn. I want you to teach me about your culture. I want you to teach me about your traditions. I want you to teach me about your language. it's a building a relationship where it's a mutual. Because Alex as well, Alex is a soccer player. I was a soccer player. And so we talk a lot about soccer, and he'd been to Scotland. So he knew Scotland and he knew what that was like. So there's that relationship. So it's not the relationship of going for questions all the time. But we have this relationship that he has this saying when I would get panicky. When are we going to arrive, Alex? And he would say, the tide goes out, Logan, and the tide comes in. So who are we meeting with, Alex? The tide goes out, Logan, and the tide comes in. And just that saying, and he would look over at me if we were in a meeting, someone would see I might be getting anxious or worried. He would look over and go, tide goes out, tide comes in. And just to calm me down. And it's through that relationship you could do that. I think that's really, really important.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And, you know,
and the other part you must have,
go ahead.
So I was going to say, you must have experienced it well, is the importance of storytelling in relationships. And
yeah.
Have you experienced that?
Oh, for sure, Logan. You know, Albert's often seen as a storyteller, but, you know, I've come to understand that when he tells a story, it's like us reading the gospel. You know, his tradition, his spiritual tradition is communicated through story, and it's not a specific type of stories. It's a narrative that sort of expresses his spirituality and the spirituality of his people, which is very, very ancient. And, you know, when there is a strong relationship of trust, you can, in a way that's not sort of diminishing or threatening in any way, say, my God, that sounds a lot like the communion of the saints to me. You know, and you can sort of see how God the Holy Spirit has spoken through both traditions, spiritual traditions, and without appropriating one of the other, that it's easy to be in a good spiritual place together, you know, and that's very important. One of the things that Albert helped me realize is the notion of birds and animals as messengers, as spiritual messengers. You know, which is not a big leap from angels, right? You know, and I've been more conscious of sometimes you see a bird at an unusual time in an unusual place, and just to sort of hold that moment. And often it reminds me to give Albert a call, you know, or just something like, I should be paying attention to something today, you know. And it's wonderful to feel that kind of, you know, as pastors, we know if you think of someone, give them a call. You know, you come to understand that pastoral instinct, and just to feel that sense of creation, you know, being a vector, being imbued with God the Holy Spirit, with Creator, and how that is integral to our spirituality is. You know, it's nice to feel that in a way that's not about reading something online or you know, but actually to be with someone for whom that is, you know, constitutive of his spirituality.
You know, some of my family, saying, having been the pastor to them when my grandson was in hospital in Ottawa, and Janine was there as well to do that. But we had a grandson who died a couple of years ago. And his mother and her sister, who are our family, are Cowichan tribes. And Carter's death was just took over the whole family. But just before that, a hawk arrived on our doorstep. It was that kind of one of those moments when the back of your neck just raised, and this hawk stuck around for a couple of days in our property. And to find out that the hawk comes at the time when you need strength and support, you're going to need this. So be aware that the Creator is with you, and the hawk coming is that messenger, as you say, as that angel. So I think those are really important things. The importance of the animals and the connection to the creation and the Creator.
Yeah. You know, when we think about the need for reconciliation comes from profound alienation, right? Alienation from God, alienation from one another, alienation from the earth, and even alienation from ourselves in a sense. And how to be alienated in any of those ways is dehumanizing. It's dehumanizing. And I think the whole colonial experience was dehumanizing for the colonizers as it was for those they colonized, for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. And in our reconciliation, we become more fully human as we meet in that place of our humanity again, you know, sort of the innocence of me in the car with a bunch of Dene kids, you know. And the enrichment we've been talking about, how our Christian spirituality is in no way inconsistent at its most fundamental and important level with Indigenous spirituality, and how, you know, our books and our boxes and our churches, in a sense, can alienate us from the earth, from creation, and to walk with, to step into reconciliation with peoples for whom creation is integral to spirituality, opens up a part of our own walk in faith, you know, and we become more fully human in the journey. It's kind of a, you know, a wonderful consequence of walking with one another with humility and vulnerability, for sure.
I think that's really important, that connection. And in Kingdom Inlet, there is a big house, there's a church, and they all speak about that connection between the big house and the church. Alex's brother, Frank Nelson, Chief Frank Nelson, sang and drummed in as bishop into the cathedral. And Alex spoke at that, and he spoke about, he like in a humorous way, said, "You have a hat, I have a hat, he's on a cedar hat." It says, "You've got a blanket, I've got a blanket, my coat and his blanket. You've got a stick, I've got a stick," his talking stick. Said, "You have candles, we have a fire." And to see those not as separate, not to separate us, but to bring us together and to unite us, like, you know, the reconciliation is living well with difference. Living well with difference. And how do we do that? How do we learn that from our First Nations culture and bring it into the church? How do we live well in the church with difference? And that's what it means for us to be reconciled, I think, as well, as Christians, as Anglicans.
Yeah. So. The circle is very powerful in certainly Anishinaabe culture, as it is in a number of First Nations cultures, as it is to some extent in Indigenous cultures generally. And I've been in a number of circles, and what facilitated and led by an Indigenous person. And what is remarkable about the circle is the safety of the circle, you know, and no one leaves the circle if there isn't peace in the circle. And things are said, things are spoken in truth. And, you know, you kind of keep going around. If something comes up that causes offense, well, it gets picked up and the circle stays there. And that's something we don't do well in non-Indigenous church conflict. You know, we fragment and alienate rather than unite in a circle and face it and work it through, in a sense. And that's very important. It's important, I think, for non-Indigenous people generally to understand we can't compartmentalize the task of reconciliation either. It's not something that's over there. It's not about, you know, helping Indigenous people. Reconciliation is fundamentally a way of life. It's integral to our spirituality as Christians. It is the gospel. You know, Jesus entered into our experience so we would be reconciled with God. Reconciliation is about entering into the experience of others we may differ with or are alienated from in an attempt to be able to tell their story and communicate our understanding of that story and the sacredness of that story. And it's, you know, we want it, again, we want to fix things that are wrong, but you can't really do that, again, until you've listened very, very carefully to those who have experienced trauma or experienced the abuses of colonialism, to say what that means. And, you know, the discovery of graves, for example, Logan, you were not a bishop at that time, but tremendous pressure on bishops, make a statement, make a statement. And I thought the only statement I can make is to tell people to listen to Indigenous voices. You know, you don't need another non-Indigenous bishop saying, you know, platitudes, however well meant. Listen to the anger, listen to the pain, listen to the, you know, trauma expressed by Indigenous peoples now. That's the only statement that matters, you know, and to kind of point to the voices that need to be heard, rather than, you know, taking on the role of a spokesperson for peoples for whom you really have no right to speak on behalf of.
That's a really good point. And I think the point of listening to the anger, not thinking of an excuse, thinking of how to defend ourselves, going into debate about it, but to receive that anger and to listen to that anger is really important. I think it's a huge part of reconciliation.
Yeah. And, you know, Logan, too, I think, sorry, go ahead, finish up.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. I've learned to own the story of the Anglican Church. You know, I was horrified, as many people were, to think that I was part of a church which could have levied such abuse on people. It was difficult to hear that, and the sense of, do I stay, do I leave, what the right thing to do is. And I came to learn that the correct thing is to speak the truth about our story. We were perpetrators. My church was a perpetrator in the enterprise called Indian residential schools, and great harm was, we were complicit in it. And then we began to listen. And as we listened, we began to repent. And we apologized not once, but twice, and we chose to walk the way of reconciliation. We have gone from being perpetrators to reconcilers, to own that story, to be able to say it not with pride, but with a sense of this is our truth. And we cannot deny any part of it. We have to integrate it and own it and live from it with humility going forward. That was important, to be able to kind of own that story and to be able to say it straightforwardly in multiple contexts, as I have since then.
And I think it's the important is the add-on part there. Apology is not enough. Apology is the first step on reconciliation. But if we think we're finished when we apologize, then we've missed the point of reconciliation. No. When Donnell always said that there's the three parts, right? It's the truth-telling part. Yeah, it was us. It wasn't somebody in the past, it was us. We have all bear the responsibility for it. The truth-telling, the healing that is needed. And the healing is for us as well, because as you said, we were part of it, we did it. And as Anglicans, there's a real need for us to be participating in healing in this. And then reconciliation is a journey, an ongoing journey. When will it end? We don't know.
Yeah, that's very, very true, Logan. You know, some people say there are sort of 4 dimensions to reconciliation. There's truth, peace, justice, and mercy, or forgiveness. Where's the starting point in reconciliation? You know, it's so but when does reconciliation happen? Well, of course, it's at the confluence of all those things. You know, it's at the confluence of peace, justice, truth, and forgiveness. And, you know, we may never achieve that. There may be moments where we achieve that, but in the end, as you say, it is sort of that stepping into all of the dimensions of reconciliation and understanding that truth is very, very painful. And sometimes justice is the first place you need to begin. At other times, it's obtaining some level of peace. You know, we think about Ukraine right now, not to go there. You know, peace is the prayer. You know, peace. Other dimensions need to be sorted out, and I think the same kind of discerning way is important as we consider and we listen carefully to the voices of Indigenous peoples. I mentioned Michelle Good. You know, control over that's about justice. You know, healing comes from, you know, different dimensions of the circle of truth, peace, justice, and mercy.
I think again, what you said is important for us is what this evening is called, is stepping into reconciliation. Take that first step. Where do we start? Do we start with justice? Do we start with peace? Just take the first step and discover what will open up to you. Be courageous enough and learn by those steps that you take. The video that was made of the reconciliation walk on the island is called Step by Step. Are we there yet? No, it's just taking some steps.
For sure.
And there's more steps to take. Yeah.
So. I've just begun to pursue and to welcome a deeper relationship with Inuit. Ottawa, as you may know, has the largest population of Inuit outside the north. And I have appointed an Inuit advisor, an Inuk woman who is wonderful and is becoming a good friend as well. And I realize, I have been to Iqaluit, I've been to Pangatung, I've been to Nunavut, how little I know, how little I know, and how much there is to learn, and how quiet I need to be to learn about Inuit culture and Inuit pain and the Inuit experience of residential schools, which is very different from First Nations, and most non-Indigenous people aren't aware of that. And one more step, can't do it all at once, need to be careful with every step in many ways. But Joe Clark spoke at the cathedral a number of years ago, and he said, most non-Indigenous Canadians have no idea what contemporary Indigenous culture is all about. We have a very nostalgic view, and he's quite right. Anyone who has not had an Indian taco at a powwow has to remedy that this summer. Go have an Indian taco.
Yeah. I think that's so true about the romantic view that we have of First Nations. But again, it's only about building that relationship, traveling with First Nations people, sitting in the big house, sitting at their events for us on the coast here, that you learn.
Yeah, and in some ways, be prepared for some anger, especially if you happen to be a clergy person. Be prepared for that, and take it on your shoulders with humility, because it's there and it does need to be expressed. And I think church leaders, identifiable church leaders, need to be very prepared and strong, and in a sense welcome those expressions of anger and pain and the uncomfortable conversations. That's important as well.
So Shane, being a dean of a cathedral with you, I've been really pleased at watching you as the bishop, and I hope that you continue in this journey of reconciliation and start sharing this news, because I think you have a really important message to tell the church, to tell the House of Bishops, and to share with the congregations in your diocese. So I think that
thank you, Logan.
What you're doing is very, very good, Shane.
Yeah, and I want you to know, Logan, that your walk as bishop, your walk through the Diocese of Islands and Inlets, was more far-reaching than you may realize. I know it was impactful in your context, but that was a wise and humble thing to do, Logan. And I thank you for that, and for your continued walk and the ways you share that with our church as well. So good to spend time with you this evening, Logan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In the traditional language of my friend Alec Nelson,
Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Bishop Logan and Bishop Shane, for that absolutely fascinating discussion. And I'll thank you more later, but I want to get into questions. We already have one. So what I'm going to ask people to do is, if you have questions, could you please type them in the chat, and we'll be able to have the bishops address your question that way. So one question that's already come to us has to do with building relationships with First Nations people. And I've heard this expressed many, many times when the topic of reconciliation comes up. How does a layperson or any person really who's involved in their own duties and responsibilities and lives in a predominantly white community, perhaps at some distance from an Indigenous community, how do you develop relationships and connections with First Nations peoples? Do you have any guidance and ideas about that?
Go ahead,
Both
Logan.
of us, or I think
Either
I
one,
heard
yeah,
a
please.
lot. So thank you for the question. I heard it a lot as bishop when I encouraged parishes to have engagements with the First Nations people around about them. A couple of answers. I always said to them, look, first of all, look, well, we don't see any First Nations. You're not looking hard enough, because on the island, First Nations people are everywhere in every community. The other thing was that people in Victoria, parishes in Victoria would say, well, there's no First Nations people in our community. Well, as I said before, the Kwakiwak, who are from Comox North on the East Coast Island, right way up across onto the mainland of British Columbia, are our relatives. They're the Anglicans. When the missionaries came, they decided the Coast Salish should be Roman Catholic, the Chalmers should be United Church of Canada, and Kwakiwak for Anglicans, but they still respect. One of the first surprises I got when I went to Letter Bay was they didn't say the bishop is here. They didn't say that bishop's here. They said our bishop is here. So there's about 500 Kwakiwak speaking people in the Greater Victoria, Kwakiwak Nation in the Greater Victoria area. So the Native Friendship Centre engage there, wander in and say, hi, I'm here. And it's that kind of taking that stepping out in those relationships.
I think that that's important. While it may be the case that there are some communities which do not have any Indigenous peoples in it, certainly there is no region in Canada that does not have Indigenous peoples in it. And, you know, a good place to begin is to simply do a search in your area for things like powwows, or there may be reservations nearby, and there's almost invariably, in most of the southern ones at least, some sort of learning center or community center. And read things online, like, you know, understand who are the first peoples of your area, your region, and try to read sources that are Indigenous wherever possible. Read novels by Indigenous peoples. You know, there's a lot more going on than you might realize. You know, during Black History Month, we lift up the story of Black Canadians, and most people don't know those stories, but they are numerous. The same is true for Indigenous peoples. There are long stories of communities, and be on guard though for kind of false elders, I would say. You know, there's a huge demand for Indigenous people to speak at events and this, that, and the other. Try to make sure that when you go to see someone who purports to be an elder, that they have the respect of their own community, that they've been lifted up and acknowledged as elders in their own community. That's important because, you know, they're the real deal kind of thing. And, you know, to try to listen to individuals, look for individuals, as I say, who have the respect of their communities. That's important. I have made some colossal missteps along the way of believing I was talking to someone who had that level of stature, and they simply did not and do not. And that makes non-Indigenous people look like we don't know what we're doing either. So take time to get to know who are the leaders, who are the credible teachers, who has the respect. And as Logan says, just take a first step, you know, go to a powwow.
Just to build upon what Shane said there about elders, age does not make you an elder.
No.
Having the respect for the community makes you an elder.
You both. I think you alluded to this a little bit in your conversation, but I'm wondering if you could maybe flesh it out a little bit more. When you speak to Indigenous peoples in your respective areas about reconciliation, what do they tell you? What are they looking for in terms of reconciliation? Do they think reconciliation is possible? Are they hopeful? What do you hear?
Yes, it's a broad spectrum of
Yeah.
the shade is the same. There's you'll have the response. Yeah, let's talk about it. Let's sit down about it. Let's see what that means. You'll have the response on the other side of that is not going to happen. Not interested in it. You know, you did it, and that's it. So it's a broad spectrum across from positive engagement to negative engagement and indifference. Indifference in some ways.
Yeah.
So there's no one way.
Yeah. A funny story, Albert and I were talking some time ago, and he was talking about some difficult people in his community. And I said, you know, Albert, the one thing Anglicans and Algonquins have in common is that we both have difficult people in our communities. You know, they're human communities and you get the range of things. But certainly I would agree with Logan, you know, everything from hostility to full engagement and indifference somewhere in the middle. In my experience of speaking with the Anishinaabe Algonquin in this area, which is unceded territory. There's no treaty in this area. Parliament Hill is literally on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. And so, you know, issues of land justice are really, really important, very, very important, as are proper recognition of Algonquins who are not that numerous in this area for all kinds of reasons, not least of which the colonizers equipped some of their allies in such a way that many Algonquins in Eastern Ontario were almost exterminated by other First Nations who had been equipped with weapons and warfare knowledge. So it's a very complex history in our area. There is also the fact that some non-Indigenous entrepreneurs have really sought to, using the language of reconciliation, bring Indigenous Algonquins in particular and other First Nations into these business ventures, which are multi-million-dollar business ventures and have the appearance of reconciliation. But what they are in effect are little mini land settlements, you know, land deals, which fragment the overall claim to the advantage of some Indigenous people over others. And it's very, very controversial. You know, not all that pretends to be reconciliation is deep justice-based reconciliation. And so there's a lot of concern for that, like recognition of Algonquins as the first people of this area, recognition of their culture and their traditions, the injustices suffered, the trauma suffered, but also proper enfranchisement for the entire group of nations, not just for some who can cut deals with business people on some plots of land.
I think for us in the West Coast, certainly the resources are there. The resources are timber, the resources are the fishing. Fishing is huge here in the West Coast. And the government's decision to put fish farms into the traditional territories, the Kwakwaka'wakw, without any conversation, you know, just raised the whole issue. Are you really interested in reconciliation? If you're interested, let's talk about fish farms on our traditional territory. I think that the resources are huge here as well.
Yeah. In Ottawa, again, with its large Inuit population and with not a good understanding on the part of non-Indigenous people or many First Nations people about the experiences of Inuit in the North, who are not only displaced geographically, but also had children-centered residential schools. It's kind of a double whammy. But a number of elders can no longer live in their communities in Nunavut or in other parts of the Arctic and are now coming to Ottawa, where there is not awareness, there are not the facilities, not the conditions to support them. And that's a big issue. And that is, you know, a part of reconciliation. How do we care for elders from Indigenous communities when the community is far, far away, and because of medical reasons and lack of resources in their home, they're now here? That's a big issue.
All right, we've got a question, Bishop Stain, with regards to the role of Albert Dumont in your diocese. What is his role generally throughout the diocese and in the cathedral specifically? And what's the engagement there between him and his people and the congregations?
Okay, so different dimensions to that. When I was the dean of the cathedral, I think Dean Beth Bretzlaff is my successor, is on the line as well. Albert was appointed as the Algonquin spiritual advisor in residence at the cathedral, or spiritual teacher in residence. That still continues. And in that capacity, he has led a number of teaching circles. In that capacity, he has been the first person to speak at certain events. Some of you may recall when Prince Philip's national commemoration was held from our cathedral in Ottawa, Albert was one of the first speakers. So that's a function of the relationships that we've formed. Albert has also connected us with others in the Algonquin community, other teachers, young people. One of our favorite caterers is an Algonquin caterer, for example. So yes, there is that kind of connecting with others. In terms of the office I hold right now, Albert is my Algonquin advisor. I have an Inuit advisor who is an Anglican Inuk, Deborah Takernick, and I have an Anglican Indigenous advisor. Albert is not a Christian, remember. So I have 3 Indigenous advisors, and I hope to appoint a Métis advisor as well. Their role is primarily to advise me, to make sure that I am able to hear and understand what is happening in those communities in my diocese. We have an All My Relations circle, which is under the broad sort of governance of the Episcopal stream as opposed to the synodical stream for Anglicans online. And the All My Relations circle is 50% Indigenous, 50% non-Indigenous. That is more of a working group which seeks to enable and facilitate reconciliation across our diocese. But my 3 advisors, the advisors to the bishop, are there to inform me as the bishop, as the senior leader in our diocese, as I seek to lead our church into the way of reconciliation, and to some extent as a resource to others in the community who wish to have a credible speaker, for example. So they would be available, always with an honorarium. It's not a free service. We need to respect the exchange that's happening. So that's kind of a long rambling answer, but I hope that's helpful. They are appointed by me primarily to ensure that I am kept directly informed of what's happening in those communities, and to ensure that I'm making good decisions or giving good guidance with respect to our journey of reconciliation in this area.
Thank you, Bishop Shane. A question about, we often talk about First Nations peoples as if they're out there, but many congregations are going to have Indigenous Anglicans, and how can we better support the needs of those Indigenous members who are Anglican and in our parish as part of our parish families?
Go ahead, Logan.
Thanks, Shane. Actually, it's interesting. As Ian, I think, mentioned, I'm an interim at a parish in Victoria, and one of the people that showed up because I was there is an elder. He was actually a warden in another parish in Victoria, and he showed up to be with me because he knew I was there. And it's a friendship we've had. He really helped me to engage the Indigenous communities on the peninsula, just outside of Victoria. And his role was a kind of developing role. He was a warden, he's the rector's warden in that parish, and he took a significant role. And he certainly had an effect on that community, how that community met, how that community listened to one another, how that community engaged First Nations communities outside as well. So I'm not really sure about the question about what do we do again. It sounds to me, what do we do for them? It's if First Nations people in our midst, let's sit and listen. How does that have an effect on our Anglican church and the shape of our Anglican church? Because remember, as we pointed out, Shane pointed out very clearly at the beginning, we were a colonial church. We came from as Anglicans, we came from the UK. We came as a colonial power. We were part of a colonial structure. With the residential schools were part of colonial power as well. And how are we going? The question for us, I think, as Anglicans, is how are we going to receive healing as a colonial church, and how are we going to move ahead? And I think one of the main ways is listening to First Nations people and recognizing that their language is important, their culture is important, their traditions are important, and what can we learn from those, rather than what we did was try to erase them from the country. What part of that will make us a better church and a better people?
Yeah. I think there's a lot in what you say, Logan. I mean, my sense is that, first of all, be conscious that there may well be Indigenous persons in your midst, as non-Indigenous people, and just be conscious of that fact. And they may come from First Nations, they may be Métis, they may be Inuit, and just be aware. But at the same time, it's very important for anyone who comes into our church, to kind of meet people in a gentle and humble way. Don't pounce on everyone who comes through the door. And as pastors, the clergy who are on, I would say, try to arrange a pastoral visit with Indigenous persons in your congregations and listen very, very carefully, as Logan said, what is that person's story? And, what would they hope for, aspire to, want to contribute? Because no population's monochrome. And listen very carefully at first, instead of assuming we should be doing something. We need to do something for those people. And if we hear the words, they mean well, but we've got to be careful about meaning well, trying to fix things, right? Let's understand, first of all, what the need is, what is being said, and to be very respectful and humble and listen very, very well.
Well, thank you very much, Bishop Shane and Bishop Logan, for that. Absolutely, I think it's a challenging conversation. You've both, I think, been very honest and open with your experiences, and I want to express my thanks for, and my thanks on the part of the group for your willingness to share that openly with us and share your stories.